Last week, just days after Slovenia announced that it would halt all arms sales to Israel, Germany followed by partially suspending weapons deliveries in response to Israel's plans to take control of Gaza City and the worsening humanitarian crisis. However, this obviously falls short of a full arms embargo, and it looks unlikely to really affect Israeli policy, prompting suggestions that if Europe really wants a real chance of influencing Israeli policy, the bloc, which holds considerable economic leverage over Israel, needs to collectively impose meaningful sanctions. So in this video, we'll explore why the EU hasn't imposed wider sanctions on Israel, and whether such measures could actually work. Let's start with some context. The EU has often used sanctions as a political tool to condemn human rights abuses and repression by governments across the world. For instance, since 2020, the EU has sanctioned Belarus for political repression and regional destabilization, targeting regime officials and state-owned companies. It also imposed arms embargoes, asset freezes, and travel bans on Syrian leaders under the regime of former President Bashar al-Assad, as well as extensive economic sanctions, which, following his ousting last year, the EU is now planning to lift. Meanwhile, in Libya, the EU has imposed restrictive sanctions on militias and warlords fueling the conflict, while Myanmar's military leaders have faced sanctions since the 2021 coup and violent crackdown on protesters. Of course, the most significant EU sanctions package in recent years has been against Russia, following its 2022 invasion of Ukraine. These sanctions aim to weaken Russia's ability to finance its war by targeting political elites, cutting off Moscow from Western markets and technology, hitting key industries, especially fossil fuel revenues, and freezing around 300 billion euros in Russian assets. So far, however, the EU has largely avoided sanctions on Israel, apart from a limited 2024 package targeting 5 settlers and 3 bodies. This is in part because many European countries have traditionally considered Israel to be an ally, but it also reflects intra-European divisions on the issue, which make it hard for the EU to impose meaningful sanctions, because such action requires unanimity among member states. Germany, Hungary, and Czechia oppose sanctions outright, while even pro-Palestinian states such as Ireland and France have avoided pushing for concrete measures. In fact, only Spain has openly called for the suspension of trade agreements. There was some speculation that the EU might suspend its trade agreement with Israel last month, following reports that Israel may have breached Article 2, which requires both parties to uphold human rights. But while EU leaders did discuss potential measures, such as halting visa-free travel for Israeli citizens, banning trade with settlements, and amending the agreement, once again, they failed to reach consensus on any measure. Another major obstacle is external pressure, particularly from the White House, who strongly opposes sanctions against Israel. This became very apparent in June, when countries like the UK, Australia, Norway, Canada, and New Zealand imposed sanctions on Israeli ministers Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, prompting the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio to condemn these moves, calling them counterproductive to efforts for a ceasefire and urging reversal. Furthermore, at least some member states are worried about retaliation from the US. For example, after Canada signaled conditional recognition of Palestine in July, Trump raised tariffs on Canadian goods to 35%. EU leaders are also keen to keep Trump on side while the war in Ukraine is ongoing, which is apparently one of the big reasons that the EU accepted such a one-sided trade deal last month. You get the idea then. Europe currently lacks the political will to impose sanctions on Israel for a variety of reasons. But this all raises the question, would sanctions even work? Well, while sanctions are often less effective than their proponents hope, it's worth noting that Israel's economy is indeed highly dependent on European trade, investment, and financial reserves. For context, in recent years, the EU has become an increasingly important trading partner for Israel, which is an export-driven economy, and is now one of Israel's 2 biggest trading partners alongside the US. The US is particularly important for technology, defense, and diamond sales, while the EU buys a broad mix of Israeli goods, including machinery, chemicals, and medical technologies. Last year, total trade between the EU and Israel, including both imports and exports, amounted to 47.2 billion euros, surpassing Israel's total trade with the US and making the EU Israel's largest trading partner. On the other side of things, Israel accounts for just 0.8% of the EU's total goods trade, a trade which is worth around 15 to 17% of the world's total. That places them at only 31st among the bloc's trading partners, and trailing both Morocco and Algeria in the wider Mediterranean region. In 2024, EU exports to Israel totaled around 26.7 billion euros, nearly double how much the EU imported from Israel. The EU is also Israel's largest foreign investor, with investments nearly twice the size of those from the US. According to IMF data, EU member states hold 72.1 billion euros in investments in Israel, compared to 39.2 billion euros from the US. Lots of this comes from the Netherlands specifically, with 50 billion euros in investment held by Dutch companies in 2023, and the Netherlands alone even tops the US. Furthermore, about a quarter of the Bank of Israel's reserves are held in Europe. Implausible as it might feel at the moment, in theory these reserves could be frozen or immobilized, similar to the sanctions implied to Russia's central bank assets, with their release potentially being made conditional on political developments, such as Israel ending hostilities or contributions to Gaza's reconstruction. Anyway, this imbalanced relationship, where Israel relies economically on the EU far more than vice versa, suggests that the EU could impose significant economic costs on Israel while facing relatively little blowback itself, unlike with Russia, where sanctions on oil and gas triggered a full-blown energy crisis in the EU. Moreover, the effectiveness of sanctions would also be compounded by the fact that Israel's economy is under some strain at the moment. After almost 2 years of continuous war, Israel is suffering from stagnant growth rates, chronic labor shortages, and an unsustainable budget deficit representing nearly 7% of GDP in 2024. Israel is also facing the prospect of a 15% tariff from Trump, which would put them under further strain. In April, Netanyahu announced plans to eliminate Israel's trade surplus with the US, which amounted to $7.4 billion in 2024. But this would require either more spending to increase imports from the US, which would put even more strain on their budget, or reducing exports to the US, which could hurt growth and make Israel's export-driven economy even more reliant on Europe. All in all, while there's reason to think that European sanctions could genuinely hurt Israel's economy and thus put pressure on Netanyahu, the question isn't whether it can, but whether it will. And for now, it's politics, not economics, that's holding it back. Now, when you're diving into complicated topics such as this, it's quite easy to get caught up in what you know without even missing a beat. But what about the stories you don't see? Or what happens when the stories you do see are purposely leaving out information to try and sway your thinking? Thankfully, our sponsor this week, Ground News, are experts at helping with just that. That's because Ground News is a website and app that collects thousands of articles from across the world and puts them all in one place for you to easily compare how the news is being covered by different outlets online. For each and every story, you can see the number of sources reporting on it, as well as the political bias, factuality, and ownership of said sources. For example, if we take this story of Norway divesting $2 trillion of Israeli assets from its wealth fund, you can see that 117 sources are reporting on it, with 25 of them coming from the left and 21 coming from the right. You can even compare the headlines to see what either side is saying, with the left portraying Norway's divestment from Israeli companies as an urgent but insufficient ethical standing, in contrast to the right, who underscores the sober, methodical nature of the fund's due diligence, stressing parliamentary oversight and cautioning against hasty divestment. That's not all though. Ground News has tons of super handy features, and our personal favourite is their blind spot feed. Here you can find stories that have been disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum, helping you challenge your perspective on someone else's media reality. Here at TLDR, we're passionate about helping you understand how bias may affect the media you consume, something that Ground News also firmly believes in. Because of this, we're offering 40% off their unlimited access Vantage Plan subscription if you use the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen. You can only access this discount through our link, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started today.